Hi, an ink guy here, except today we're looking at a paper, so I'm going to be your paper pal. Kind of like Clippy from Microsoft, except hopefully less annoying in this bottom corner. We're going to be taking a look at copy paper. Now, this comes at a request from a number of viewers. First, here's a comment from Yvonne. My idea might be the least popular topic going, but I'm interested in sustainability regarding the hobby. I'm looking for American-made papers from sustainable harvest wood and for eco-friendly paper making practices, or at least North America-made paper. In other words, not paper that has to be shipped across the oceans from countries too small to have their own forests. There's much more that's been written, but that's the part that I'm going with first. Also, there's ThinFam91 who says, I'm a student, so affordable but fountain pen friendly paper is very helpful to me. So I'm going to start by pointing out my favorite copy paper is hammer mill paper. Now, hammer mill paper is made and remade in America. That's definitely something they take pride in. But being made in America is more than just a point of pride. It provides their customers with real concrete benefits. At least that's what Google says. First, let's take a look at 32-pound copy paper. The first paper we're going to take a look at is 32-pound copy paper. 32-pound paper is ideal for professional presentations and documents with heavy ink coverage. Looking at the back of the page to start with, because I feel that bleeding and ghosting is one of the most important features that a paper can handle it. Now, we can see that it really does handle it very well in the heaviest version, allowing you to write on the back of the page without any kind of major issue. We can see, comparing it to the Clairefontaine as a side-by-side, that there is a tiny bit of spread that does occur from it. So it's handling it very well, but this medium flow fine does get just a hair thicker in terms of the lines. Handles it very well though, not any kind of a real problem, so no big deal. Looking at the wet fine nib, we see that it has the same amount of spread that the medium flow fine did, so it really isn't affecting it in any kind of way there. We're getting no feathering that's going on. We see that the color slightly dulls down a little bit, but just barely. Now, again, we're not seeing any kind of degrade in the performance of this ink. To see how well the color holds, we're looking at a medium flow, medium nib. And just looking as the color shifts from one paper onto the other, we see that it's holding the color very well, being very true to it. Now, we also see that on the Clairefontaine, there's a little bit of shading that this particular red does offer. It's there kind of when we look at it on the 32-pound paper, not as standout. It's more as a word-to-word type thing, but it's still holding its own. We go to the very wet broad. Now, this is a very wet broad, really meant to punish a paper. It's the only reason that I have it on there. Yes, we do see some spread that's going on. We see the faintest hints of some feathering that can occur with a very wet, broad nib. This was really setting it up for failure, and if this is the worst that it has to offer, I'm going to say that that's really pretty darn good. Now, 28-pound copy paper. 28-pound copy paper is ideal for full-color documents, including flyers and brochures. First and foremost on a 24-pound, let's take a look at the back of the page where we get no bleeding, no ghosting, so that you can easily write back here, making this a very good paper to use with fountain pens. Now, when we go over to the front and we look at the tone of the paper, we see that it is still very white, the slightest bit off a pure white when we compare it to the Clairefontaine right next to it. Looking at the medium flow fine nib right here at the top, we see that we have no problem when it comes to feathering or spreading, though there is a tiny bit of spread. Just take a look at walked and walked right next to each other. It's tiny, it's there, it's not a problem. When it gets to the wet fine nib, we do see that the same amount of spread that occurs, which is almost nothing, but it does exist. Still no feathering, no problems whatsoever, holds the color without a problem. Speaking of holding the color, we're going to take a look at the medium flow, medium nib, and we see that the color of the writing itself unchanged. Still not feathering, still the same amount of spread that occurs. The bit of shading that does show up in this ink also shows up in the writing. I think it does a little bit better on this than it did on the 32 pound. Kind of amusing there. I didn't expect that. Going to the wet broad, truly here to punish the paper. And what we get is the same tone of the ink. It's not altering it at all. We are getting the same kind of shading. I mean, you see it pretty well in Eternal. You see that in there's some shading that shows up, but it's not a ton, not huge. I think the wet broad really exposing any issues that this would have. Yes, it still spreads. It spreads more than it did with the others. Tiny, tiny feathers, barely there. You see it on the LK of Walked, but still have great performance with fountain pen inks. Working our way down to 24-pound copy paper. 24-pound copy paper is ideal for two-sided printing with minimal show-through on proposals and presentations. Looking at the back of the page to start with, you see that we still have no bleeding, no ghosting as any kind of an issue. This is really working especially well. It's why I like Hammermill paper. It's one of my favorite, if not my favorite, of all of the copy papers I can easily get here. When we look at the front of the page, first comparing the medium flow fine nib, we see that the color holds. It does have that tiny bit of spread, but it is not any kind of an issue when you looked at Walked right next to Walked. Holds the color with no problem. When we go to the wet fine nib, same amount of spread that would occur, not any kind of a real problem for me, but it does exist. No spreading going on. The color holds straight. Again, look at Walked next to Walked, barely noticeable difference. When we move to the medium flow, medium nib, we're going to focus on Eternal and Eternal. These two show us that, yes, there is that same amount of spread. No, we're not getting any kind of feathering. There is shading that is in both. It is not as standout on the 24-pound copy paper as it is on Clairefontaine. But we're also talking about a huge price difference between the two of them. As we move to the wet broad nib, something that's really there just to punish the paper and see what it can do. We're going to focus again on Eternal and Eternal. We see that the color is very much holding the same. Yes, there's some spread going on in the 24-pound paper, but it is not very bad at all. It's incredibly usable. I wouldn't see an issue. We get no feathering that's happening. We do see that the shading that shows up in the first Eternal is still showing up on the 24-pound copy paper. It is doing fantastic work here. Up last is the 20-pound copy paper. 20-pound copy paper is ideal for everyday black and white printing, such as emails and drafts. Now, you may have noticed that my copy paper in my reviews lately don't tend to bleed through a lot. Though they get very deep into the paper, I almost never have it touch the paper underneath. And that's because I've largely gone to Hammermill 20-pound paper. It's my go-to brand of copy paper. So up first, when we're looking at the back of the page, we see that the ink does get deep into the paper constantly. Does mean that I probably wouldn't use the back of the page, but it never bleeds through, never touches the page underneath, just gets deep into the paper, but it is not made for this type of usage. Looking at the front where we compare it to the Clairefontaine, up first is the medium flow fine nib. Walked next to Walked, slight bit of spread. Tiny feathers do exist. You see it on the KED at the end on a 20-pound, but not any kind of a problem. This still becomes very usable with fountain pens. When we move down to the wet fine nib, if we tried to now look Eternal and Eternal, we see that yes, there is spread. Yes, there is some tiny feathering. This is a much wetter pen. The color holds. I think what we're getting is basically usable on a 20-pound, far outside of its normal normal usage. Moving to the wet medium, we get a lot of spread that's going on. This is, sorry, a medium flow, medium nib, not a wet medium. We do get the spread that's going on. We do get tiny feathers that show up again. Looking at walked, we see the LKED, tiny feathers. Really nothing to worry about. The color, I think, is a bit more muted on the 20-pound copy paper, but not horribly. It just doesn't have some of the same, I want to say, character that it has on the Clairefontaine. But this is a harsh comparison. Then we go to the wet broad nib. And of course, with a wet broad, there's quite a bit of spread that occurs. There is some feathering, but I'll tell you what, the feathering, nowhere like you would have expected on some of the papers that I use in my much earlier reviews. So Eternal to Eternal, you see that spread, you see that tiny little bit of feathering, you see that the shading that exists on the Clairefontaine does not exist on the 20-pound copy paper. Now, I really want to send the point home of how much I enjoy Hammermill paper as a brand for my copy paper. That they, a while back, did a campaign. They were looking for influencers to, do with their social media stuff. And I applied and did not get selected. I don't think I have the following for it. And that is okay. And the fact that I did not get selected did not mean that I chose something else. I went with what I know does the best for me. So, with being passed up, again, I don't blame them. I'm tiny in the world. That's why I'm so small in the corner here. Let me jump into the center. This to me is the best copy paper, and 24-pound is really where you need to go.